What is the deal of the century? Hi, I'm Joel Rosenberg, founder and editor-in-chief of All Israel News and our sister site, All Arab News. The deal of the century is an interesting term because it refers colloquially throughout the popular culture to President Donald Trump's peace offer, his peace deal that he put on the table for the Israelis and the Palestinian leadership to consider and hopefully accept. Now, in my research, I don't find that President Trump actually ever used that term. Maybe not ever, but not at the beginning. It wasn't his term. It wasn't the term deal of the century that his team used. The term actually comes from Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who, when meeting with President Trump, said that he would do everything he could to help Israel and the Palestinians make peace, and he really appreciated President Trump and the deal of the century that he and his team were developing. Now, for about 3 years in the Trump administration, he and his team were developing this deal. Jared Kushner, the son-in-law and senior advisor to President Trump, was ultimately the architect of the deal. But the point man was somebody that I know well and have interviewed extensively and spent quite a bit of time with, Jason Greenblatt. We've interviewed him for All Israel News. Jason Greenblatt was the day-to-day special negotiator, traveling here to Israel, traveling to the Palestinian territories, traveling to the Arab world. And for the first year and a half or so, they were just listening, trying to understand what was possible. What had been the sort of the set pieces that previous peace negotiators had tried to say, this is a definite, we have to have this piece and that piece and all these other pieces. And Jason and Jared and the rest of their team, David Friedman, the ambassador from the United States here to Israel during the Trump administration, a key friend and lawyer and ally of President Trump, they and their team continued to listen to all kinds of voices. What has worked? What could work? What has been terrible? Who has been ignored? What perspective has been ignored? And is there any way for this new team to do things differently? Right? Arab-Israeli peace negotiators have been trying for 100 years to solve this conflict, and they hadn't gotten there. So eventually, the Trump team began to craft a plan, and ultimately, it was released in January of 2020 at the White House. Now, what was interesting about the rollout of the deal of the century, as it were, is that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu attended that event. But so did the ambassadors from 3 Arab countries that did not have peace or normalization deals in place at that point with Israel. One of the ambassadors was the ambassador from the United Arab Emirates, a friend of mine, Yusuf Al-Otaiba. Another was the ambassador from the Kingdom of Bahrain, another friend, Abdullah Rashid Al-Khalifa. These 2 men were very interesting because their countries eventually, by the end of 2020, had made peace with Israel, but they hadn't at that point. Also, the ambassador from the Sultanate of Oman was present. So that was interesting. 3 Arab ambassadors of countries that did not have peace with Israel attending a rollout of this deal of the century plan. A vision for peace is what was formally called. Now, I've read that plan. 180 pages, and we've got on our site a link to the full plan. You can read it for yourself. I would encourage you to do it. The deal of the century was the most detailed peace plan between Israel and the Palestinians ever laid out by any American administration. 180 pages, maps explaining exactly what the Trump team thought, okay, this part would go to Israel, that part would go to the Palestinians, and so forth. It dealt with economic projects, $50 billion of investment from Arab and other countries to help build out a Palestinian economy, to make it viable, to create 1 million new jobs for the Palestinian people. It was interesting in a number of other ways: water desalination plants, electrical plants, all kinds of infrastructure to help a Palestinian state, which Trump supported in the plan, become viable, something that could work. Now, what was also interesting about the plan was that it dramatically increased, that's right, you heard me, increased the amount of land that would be under the sovereign control of the Palestinian people. It increased it. But what was interesting is that it didn't increase it in what we normally call the West Bank. The West Bank is known to Israelis as Judea and Samaria. These are biblical heartlands, and many Israelis don't want to give it up at all. Other Israelis, and I would say that probably the majority of Israelis would say, well, we might be willing to make some sort of deal, but there are certain sections, blocks of cities and towns and villages where Jews are living and where they've built a society in some of the biblical names of places, Shiloh and others, where this is where we want to live and we're going to stay here. And the Israeli government supports that position. So what the Trump team did is said, okay, if Israel keeps what's known as the settlements, these settlement blocks where Israelis are already living in Judea and Samaria, we sort of squiggle the lines so that that's part of the sovereign state of Israel, then that does reduce by about 33% the amount of land that the Palestinians would have for their state. So how do we compensate it? This is known in the diplomatic language as land swaps, meaning Israel will get this, but the Palestinians will get that. And here, the Trump team was fairly creative. In that, they created large swaths of land along the Egyptian border and expanding out the territory of the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip theoretically would be part of a Palestinian state. Unfortunately, currently, it's under the control of a terrorist organization known as Hamas, which is a violent, horrific arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, a terrorist arm of the Islamic jihadist movement out of Egypt. So that's a problem. Let's set that aside for the moment. The point would be this strip of land along the Mediterranean coast, known as the Gaza Strip, used to be controlled by Egypt, now is sort of autonomous, independent. Israel pulled out of there in 2005. But Israel or at least the Americans thought, why don't we make that strip bigger, wider, deeper? That, plus these large swaths of land along the Egyptian border, so you'd have a contact with a major Arab state, the largest Arab state, Egypt, along with all these other sections, that could create a Palestinian state even larger than what's ever been envisioned. Now, the Israelis cautiously embraced the plan. Netanyahu was quite effusive, actually, about it, but some critics, analysts would say that he was enthusiastic because he knew the Palestinians would never accept it. So it gave him the freedom to be, woohoo, this is fantastic. It's sure enough, the Palestinian Authority President, Mahmoud Abbas, absolutely not only rejected the plan, he definitely did, he had rejected even talking to the Trump administration for several years. None of his senior officials met with the Trump team. Why? Because early on in the Trump administration, December of 2017, President Trump decided to fulfill an American law that had been passed back in the early 1990s. And that law said that Jerusalem, right here, is the eternal, indivisible capital of the state of Israel. And that law not only said that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, which the United States had actually never recognized before that law, the law also said that the U.S. Embassy, which had been located in Tel Aviv, needed to be moved to the capital, to Jerusalem. And the president decided that after all the other presidents before him that had promised it, but had never actually fulfilled that law from the 1990s, and had used a loophole in the law to sign waivers to not actually do those things, Trump said, no, enough. It's time. We have to be realistic. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and the U.S. Embassy should be there. And we won't define whether the exact borders of Jerusalem. The borders of Jerusalem, the municipal borders, the city borders, can still be negotiated in a final agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. They have to come and sit down and do it together, but the moving of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, according to President Trump and his plan, did not have to prejudice whether the final details and borders were set. That's a little bit complicated. I realize that, but the point of it from the Israeli side was the Israelis were very happy, incredibly happy, not just the government but the people, that finally the only superpower in the world and Israel's major strategic ally, the United States, was finally recognizing some fundamental truths about Israel, right? Our prime minister lives here in Jerusalem, works here in Jerusalem. The president of Israel lives and works here in Jerusalem. Our Supreme Court, our parliament, it's all here. All the government offices are right here in Jerusalem. And yet there's been this fiction for the last 75 years or so that Jerusalem really wasn't the capital. So all that to say, Israelis were very happy, but the Palestinian leadership went ballistic. I mean, they were furious that Trump would make this decision, that he would then try to ask them to be part of a peace process when they felt betrayed. Now, is that right? Is that wrong? I'll let you be the judge of that. But the point is, this is the dynamic. And this is why the Palestinian leadership decided to cut off all contact. Well, as they did that, cut off contact with Trump and his team, Trump made a series of other moves that were not positive for the Palestinians. But he kept telling them, if you come to the table, if you negotiate a final agreement, you don't even have to agree with my plan, fine, it's an offer, it's a suggestion. Come and negotiate, discuss it, and we will help you get to a final agreement. If you do that, we will start giving you financial aid again. We will rebuild the diplomatic relationship between the United States and the Palestinian people and leadership. But it didn't happen. And now with the new Biden administration in, the question is whether the deal of the century is operable at all. It certainly is not under the Biden team. Are elements something that the Biden team may incorporate into a future discussion? Maybe. We'll have to see. But overall, President Biden and his closest advisors have been very much opposed to Donald Trump at every level, including their deal of the century offer. So, yet another peace deal seems to have hit the dustpan, the wastebasket. We'll have to see. But I will say this. One of the interesting things that came out of all the controversy over the deal of the century was the argument that many made that having put those pieces on the table, that Trump had moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, declared Jerusalem the capital of Israel, and put a plan on the table that the Palestinians had rejected, that all those things would prevent any other Arab country from making peace with Israel. And we know that that actually did not happen, just the reverse. The Palestinian rejection of the deal of the century set into motion 4 historic, dramatic peace and normalization agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Republic of Sudan, and the Kingdom of Morocco. Other Arab countries are also actively discussing whether they want to join this peace movement, and they seem to look at the Palestinian leadership rejection of Trump's offer not as something that they disagree with, that Trump's plan was somehow perfect and it should have been embraced. No, but the frustration, there's growing frustration among Arab leaders in this region. I've talked to them personally in their palaces. They're growing frustrated that Palestinian leaders seem to say no to just about everything. And that has sort of opened the door, interestingly enough, to historic Arab-Israeli peace agreements, normalization agreements that most people did not think were possible. These are stories that are ongoing. They're fascinating. They have a lot of nuances, and we're covering all of it at All Israel News and All Arab News. I'm Joel Rosenberg in Jerusalem. Stay tuned. There's more to come.